Hi, welcome to Session 8 of History 3375, CIA and the Third World. Today we're going to be looking at the intervention in the Congo. One of the things that distinguishes this from the earlier interventions that we've looked at as we get into the actual activities of the CIA is that this case is compressed into a space of a little more than 6 months from the time of Congolese independence in June of 1960 until January of 1961. We're talking a little over 6 months in time. So as we go through it and I'm discussing events, I often will not make reference to a particular year because it's all compressed into this short period of time. And we will see as well that when it comes down to tactics, which happens to be one of the critical factors here, we're really talking about one very specific tactic, partly because the opportunities for the CIA were limited in time frame. In other words, they didn't have time to develop a highly elaborate plot. Here they were working sort of ad hoc over a relatively short period of time. So those are some distinctive characteristics of this particular intervention. But first, as we've done with each of these cases, I want to look at historical background and specifically look at the interactions between Europeans and Africans starting back as early as the 15th century and then bringing it up to the contemporary era to understand what was the historical crisis in the Congo that brought American intervention at the end of the 1950s and beginning of the 1960s. If we go to the first slide, you'll see that European interactions with people along the Congo Basin, in other words, along the Congo River in Central West Africa, extend back to the 1500s. At that time, the 1400s I should say, at that time, the Congo region, the coastal area, was dominated by what became known as the Kingdom of the Congo. The Kingdom of the Congo was a large trading empire that essentially relied upon trade as its major source of economic activity and was dominated really by a population consisting of the Congolese people and a leader known as the Mani Congo. That leader essentially headed a large system of tribal relationships between himself and the larger population. In other words, he is an absolute ruler only in the most limited sense, that he has to have cooperation from the larger population in order to rule this area. This is typical of rule in this trading empire, the Kingdom of the Congo, back in the 1400s. So the Mani Congo is technically the supreme ruler, but he also depends upon a series of complex relationships with the groups within his kingdom in order to make this system work. Now, the Portuguese arrive at this spot, the Congo Basin, on the west coast of Africa, in 1482. Diogo Cao, who is a Portuguese explorer, arrives there at this time. When he first has this encounter with the Mani Congo, there is a surprising reaction. The Mani Congo embraces Cao and the Portuguese and soon converts to Catholicism, away from the indigenous religious beliefs that dominated his empire, his population. The fact that he would so readily embrace the Europeans seems strange, but in fact, the Mani Congo, and this was not his name, it's the title that he bears, the king, had a specific motivation for embracing the Europeans. Several reasons why he would want to do this. First of all, by adopting Catholicism, he freed himself from the limitations on his rule established by local religious leaders. In the Kingdom of the Congo, the monarch did not simply make decisions independently. He had to consult with the chief religious figures in society before he could make these decisions. But if he separated himself from local religious beliefs, he was no longer limited by those religious leaders. Furthermore, the Portuguese offered access to firearms, giving him a major technological advantage over his enemies, over those whom he wished to conquer. So there were very practical reasons why this local leader quickly embraced the Europeans. And as we will see, it establishes a precedent, because in the future, other leaders in Africa will look to the advantages of alliance with European powers in order to enhance their own power within Africa. Now, of course, the Portuguese have their own reason for wanting to be friends with the Mighty Congo. One of the principal reasons was the slave trade. They were anxious to find slaves to work the sugar plantations, which they already had on islands in the South Pacific, and would soon develop in Brazil as well. And this became a major mode of exchange between the Kingdom of the Congo and the Portuguese in the decades ahead. Now, this relationship was further cemented by the son of the ruling Mighty Congo, the man who first encountered Diego Cao, his son Afonso. Now, Afonso succeeded to his father's throne in 1506. But according to the rules of the Kingdom of the Congo, he was not the legitimate heir. Power was not handed down to one son. This was a matrilineal society. Instead, power went through the wife's family, the mother's family. But Afonso had managed to seize power with the assistance of the Portuguese, who of course asserted the European tradition that power was handed down in a dynasty from father to son. So Afonso had another reason to embrace the Portuguese. They helped legitimize his seizure of power. In the years ahead, under his successors, Alvaro I and II, there was a further centralization of power by the Mighty Congo, by the ruler, and an enhancement of power made possible to no small degree by this alliance with the Portuguese, who provided, of course, a Catholic religion that allowed them to ignore local religious leaders, provided them with weapons, and also provided them with the legitimizing principle by which these people inherited control. However, over time, this alliance was going to undermine the power of the Kingdom of the Congo. Part of the reason for that is fairly simple. The slave trade itself was bound to cause deep fissures within this society. When you're out hunting other people to turn them into slaves, that is bound to cause deep divisions, as it did within the Kingdom of the Congo. Furthermore, the Portuguese began looking further south along the coast of Africa to the area now known as Angola to secure slaves, and began developing a greater economic focus south of the Kingdom of the Congo. Internal fractures caused by these battles over the slave trade, caused by the alienation that the dynasty's embrace of the Portuguese had brought about, caused by the shift of the slave trade further south, all led to the rapid decline of the Kingdom of the Congo. And by 1678, the capital of the kingdom had been abandoned, and increasing social disintegration followed. And as that happened, the Portuguese began asserting greater and greater control over this part of West Africa. The importance of this story, again, has to do with the decision by local elites, the Mighty Congos, to embrace a European power as a way of strengthening themselves, but also contributing to the undermining of the long-term stability of their own society. We're going to see that happen again as time proceeds in this part of Africa. In fact, as we jump forward in time to the 19th century, we find a new European power that is involving itself in the affairs of the people of the Congo region. This time further up the Congo River, more towards the central portion of Africa. And this new power came in the person of King Leopold II of Belgium. Leopold was looking for colonies. This, of course, is the era of rapid European colonization of Africa. The scramble for Africa, as it became known, as Africa was carved up into a series of European colonies in the second half of the 19th century. The specific focus of Leopold's interest at this time is the Congo River Basin, the area of the river running through Central Africa. And his agent for his interests is, interestingly enough, an American journalist named Henry Stanley. Stanley had earned international fame as a newspaper reporter when he had gone to Africa looking for the British missionary, medical missionary, Dr. David Livingstone. There's this famous story of Stanley trekking through the central portions of Africa and finally coming upon David Livingstone and saying, "Dr. Livingstone, I presume," and embracing him and making quite a reputation for himself, and finding Livingstone, nothing of whom had been heard in several years as he carried out missionary activities in Africa. And in any case, what came out of all of this was Stanley had a first-hand experience of the region, was known as an intrepid explorer, and was someone who could deal with the local chieftains in the region. What Henry Stanley began doing was negotiating a series of agreements with these local tribal leaders, which they saw as enhancing their power, which Stanley and King Leopold saw as turning over control of their territories to Leopold. So from the European perspective, what these agreements really did was grant them control over large stretches of territory in Central Africa. To put a legal face on this, Leopold created what was known as the International African Association in 1876. It was essentially composed of this series of agreements with local chieftains that, again, in their minds, was a way of enhancing their own power by associating with a European power, but in fact was granting to King Leopold direct control over their territories. These arrangements were finally given international legitimacy at the Berlin Conference in 1884. The Berlin Conference was simply this. It was a meeting of the major European powers to hash out exactly how they were going to govern their creation of colonial empires. What rules applied? What did it take to establish national control over a particular territory in Africa? These were the rules of the game, if you will. And in the process, other European powers came to recognize the large acquisitions of territory that Leopold II had made through his agent Henry Stanley. This collection of territories was now given the euphemistic name of the Congo Free State. Not a lot was free in the Congo Free State. What it really meant was that this was going to be a system of concessions to entrepreneurs and corporations. This is how this colony would be run. In other words, King Leopold would set up a very limited administrative structure to rule what was called the Congo Free State. But its actual development would be left in the hands of private entrepreneurs and corporations that paid for concessions to operate within the Congo Free State. This type of arrangement, which was not unique to the Congo, became the worst form of colonialism in Africa. because there was very little control from Europe. And entrepreneurs were left to do pretty much what they chose in trying to make money. In other words, the abuse of the local population almost knew no limits because the supposed European power governing the area was taking very little direct role in determining how this province or this colony would be administered. The reputation of the Congo Free State became so bad that it became a matter of international scandal in Europe by the end of the 19th century. And one famous literary work that played a major role in focusing attention on the scandalous treatment of the population in the Congo was Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness. And if you look at the next slide here, you'll see that Conrad's work, which was published in 1899, most people are familiar with, it provides eventually the sort of storyline for the movie Apocalypse Now, if you've seen that. It's basically the same storyline, which is the story of a colonial official, if you will, businessman who goes to what is never officially denoted, but what is obviously the Congo, and witnesses there the degradation of the local population and how the Europeans who supposedly govern them have themselves slipped into these lives of abuse and violence against the population, have become increasingly corrupted by their ability to exercise unlimited authority over the local population. The Heart of Darkness helped trigger a general outcry in Europe against the mistreatment of the Congolese people. Eventually, the Belgian government was forced to take action because this colony was not a Belgian government colony. It was the personal property of King Leopold II. Finally, in 1909, the Belgian government intervened and transferred control of the Congo directly to the government. So it was no longer a personal property of the dynasty, but instead had become a state colony. Now, it would be nice to think that as a result of that intervention, that there was a dramatic improvement in the treatment of the local population, but that is not the case. The extraction of wealth still was the primary driving force for the Belgian state, as it had been for Leopold II. And the treatment of the population reflected that unlimited power that the local concessionaires still exercised in the Congo. More specifically, the treatment of the population on rubber plantations, which provided a major source of income for the colony, was horrendous. It was common practice to cut off the hands and feet of Congolese working on these plantations as a method of discipline. If they were found to be trying to escape from the plantation, if they were believed not to be working hard enough, if they were rebellious, they would find themselves having a hand or a foot removed. They never took all of them because then, of course, if they took both your hands, you couldn't tap rubber trees for rubber. And the same with your feet. They only cut one off. The fact that this was a common practice is reflected in the fact that there are photos showing the local supervisors bringing baskets of hands and feet to the overseer of plantations to demonstrate that they were doing their job. We're disciplining the local working population. We can prove that because here's a bushel of hands and feet that we cut off recently to discipline these people. These are just some of the more extreme examples of the mistreatment of the population that continued right through the early part of the 20th century. So the transfer of control from Leopold to the government of Belgium did not mean a great deal in terms of benefits for the local population. After World War I, a phenomenon occurred that has been called generally in Africa the second occupation of Africa. And what that means is that after the war, when economic conditions in Europe were generally bad, tens of thousands of Europeans fled their homelands to go to Africa to find their fortune. So there was a vast increase in the number of Europeans living in the African colonies after World War I, as tens of thousands of people left Europe itself, hoping for new opportunities in Africa, meaning that they were going to take more land and more economic opportunities from the local population and put them in their own hands. So this was hardly a benefit to the local population in the Congo because it meant further exploitation, further displacement. And indeed, by this time, by about the 1920s, the population in the Congo had decreased by about 50% over the previous 100 years. That's an estimate. Okay? We never have any kind of accurate figures here. But it's estimated there was about a 50% decline from the early 19th century to the early 20th century. Now, if it's going down 50%, that's an extreme drop because, of course, you have to realize that people are being born every year. There's a birth rate. Obviously, the population is disappearing at a very high level. Now, how much of this consisted of people simply dying from maltreatment versus the number of people who simply fled from the Congo colony into other colonies to escape mistreatment, we'll never know for sure. Certainly, it was a large mixture of both. People dying from mistreatment, but also people simply saying, I've got to get out of here, I've got to cross the border and get out of this colony because of the mistreatment that I'm suffering. But clearly, conditions were so horrendous that people were dying and leaving the colony at very high rates throughout the time of the Belgian occupation, starting from the 1870s on. Now, these were the conditions still prevailing in the Congo by the end of World War II, when the struggles for independence in Africa begin to pick up speed. And this is the time that the Congo itself, although somewhat late in the process, but it is the process in which the Congo itself will become involved, and it is that process that eventually leads to the U.S. intervention. Now, independence in Africa came sporadically and in a variety of ways, some peaceful, some violent. One of the more peaceful approaches to independence came on the hump of Africa, that great protrusion of Africa into the Atlantic, in a British colony known as the Gold Coast. The Gold Coast was the scene of an independence movement in the late 1940s, led by this man, Kwame Nkrumah. Like many African independence leaders, he had been educated in the West. In fact, he'd been educated in the United States and Britain. And out of that experience, he had fashioned an ideology of independence, which in part took basic Western principles and argued, if indeed, according to the West, people have a right to self-determination, to democratic government, etc., then by all means, we Africans must be entitled to precisely those rights, and we want them now. He helped form the People's Convention Party, which became the main political vehicle for this independence struggle. And its name comes from the fact that what Nkrumah and his allies were pushing for was a national convention. In other words, the election of representatives by the people of the Gold Coast who would then determine the future of the colony. Now, to try to achieve that goal, Nkrumah launched a series of protests and boycotts where large parts of the population would engage in mass demonstrations and also agreed not to buy products from British merchants as a way of protesting their lack of freedom. Finally, in 1951, the British agreed to hold a referendum on the future of the colony. This at a time when Nkrumah himself was serving a jail term for sedition. Nevertheless, the vote went overwhelmingly in favor of the Convention People's Party and their demand for independence. Nkrumah was soon released from jail, and in a series of steps between 1951 and 57, the colony was given increasing independence and finally full independence in 1957. So this process was a relatively peaceful one, but it was influenced by a number of factors. One is that the local population had a fair amount of economic power. Given the Gold Coast tropical climate, the British had generally chosen not to go in large numbers to this colony. It wasn't very healthy. Instead, they had largely extracted wealth from the colony through a series of merchant houses, British merchant houses, that purchased the principal local crop, coffee, and sold to the local population European imported goods, mostly British goods, of course. So a good deal of economic power remained in the hands of what we can call middle-class commercial farmers. And these people helped form the core of the independence struggle. So there is a fairly coherent, what we would call relatively well-off, core population in the Gold Coast that can lead this movement. And at the same time, there are not a large number of Europeans living here proportionally who would fight the independence movement, who would want to preserve the colonial system. It's largely a small group of merchants and British colonial administrators. So the decision for Britain isn't that difficult to grant independence and to allow the Gold Coast to emerge as the independent nation of Ghana in 1957. So those kinds of conditions could lead to a relatively peaceful transition when there was a coherent independence movement and when the number of European residents is relatively small and therefore there was not a large block of them demanding that the colonial order be preserved. And indeed, in the 1950s, the British and the French both began a process of decolonization in Africa. This was not driven by altruistic motives. They were facing mass protests in places like Ghana, on the east coast of Africa, in places like Kenya. They were facing armed uprisings. And it was taking a substantial toll on their resources to try to maintain this colonial system. And as a result, both the French and the British concluded that the wisest course of action was to gradually grant independence to these colonies, confident that given the fact that their elites had largely been educated in British and French schools and universities, that their economies were closely tied to the fairly powerful economies of England and France, that England and France would still extract a good deal of economic benefit from these former colonial possessions. As a result, for example, the British had a team available of a color guard, musicians, etc., that they could send off to one independence ceremony after another as they gradually granted independence, knowing full well, of course, that they would still retain considerable influence, particularly economic influence, as these colonies achieved independence. Other European powers, however, did not quite see themselves in the same position, particularly Belgium and Portugal. For both of these countries, they see themselves as relatively small and impoverished compared to France and England. They are far more reluctant to surrender their colonies. Indeed, Portugal and Belgium had both been in the process, if you will, of recolonizing their colonial holdings in Africa, wanting to send excess population to Africa for people to find economic opportunities there. The last thing they wanted to do was suddenly surrender those economic opportunities, fearful that they did not have the economic power themselves to retain control over these economies if colonialism ended. In the Congo, for Belgium, that particularly meant the mineral wealth of the Congo. As important as rubber plantations still were in the Congo, the fact was the main source of the Congo's wealth by the 1950s was clearly its mineral wealth. Products, especially copper, cobalt, but almost 100 different minerals of market value could be found in the Congo. And one company in particular, a company called Union Minière, which was actually a joint venture between Belgium and Britain. Union Minière monopolized much of the mining industry in the Congo. So here was a vital source of wealth the Belgians felt for their economy, and they were loath to surrender it, despite the increasing numbers of independence movements that were erupting around Africa. The Belgians made no concessions initially to calls for independence in the Congo. In fact, the Belgians had largely unprepared the Congo for independence. Well, the French and the British, over time, had educated a significant minority in their colonies for the purpose of serving in colonial bureaucracies. And again, this is a very practical-minded purpose to this. It was cheaper to hire Africans to fill menial positions in the bureaucracy than it would be to import Europeans to do those same jobs. You need a clerk, a postman, etc. Far better to provide education locally to the population and let those people fill those jobs than have to pay the salary of a European that you brought in to do it. So the French and the British had, in their own way, prepared their colonies for independence because they had at least provided for a minority, a small minority of the population, to get educations all the way through university level. The Belgians, however, would have none of that. They had no intention of staffing even their own bureaucracy with any significant number of Africans. And if we look at this slide, you'll see that as of the 1950s, the Congo had about 14 million people. Of 14 million people, only 16 Africans were college graduates, and only 134 were high school graduates out of 14 million. And again, this didn't happen accidentally. Congolese were largely excluded from any education. It was considered a practical policy. How do you maintain control? Well, keep the population illiterate. That'll prevent the formation of political parties, the expression and sharing of political opinions outside a very small circle of people. We don't want that kind of communication going on. We can prevent it by keeping the population uneducated. So the Congo was particularly unprepared for independence at this time because the Belgian government had seen to it that only a tiny, tiny sliver of the Congolese population got any degree of education at all. In general, not speaking just about the Congo, but it certainly reflects these issues. The era of colonial rule in Africa, roughly from the middle of the 19th century to the middle of the 20th century, left a series of unfortunate legacies. One was regionalism. When the Europeans were forming colonies in Africa, they were not creating borders based on the idea, gee, what would be the best composition of people and territory to create a nation in the future? They weren't worried about that kind of thing at all. What they were worried about is what can we grab and where are valuable resources that we want to get a hold of. As a result, if you look at many of the European colonies in Africa, you will find that within their borders they had incorporated a diverse range of people in terms of ethnic and linguistic backgrounds, and very often included people who were often competing with each other for land, for resources, etc. In other words, they're often bitter rivals who now found themselves within the same political border because they're being made part of a European colony. The Congo was a good example. The largest single group are the Congolese people, many of whom once made up the Kingdom of the Congo. But there are a diverse range of other groups, the Katangese people in southeastern parts of the Congo, and then a whole range of linguistic and ethnic groups, more than 100 others, spread out across the territories, particularly north and northeastern Congo regions at this time. So here you have a society that's composed of an incredible array of distinct linguistic and ethnic groups, and groups that are often competitive with each other, such as the Congolese and the Katangese. So regionalism and tribalism are immediate problems. These are not, in most cases, coherent political entities. And there is the issue of economic underdevelopment, that while certain resources have been exploited, such as mining resources, most of these societies have been left grossly underdeveloped in terms of levels of education, economic infrastructure. Where are the roads, the railroads? What you have is, here's a mining center, here's a plantation center, here's a railroad that connects it to the port, and that's our major development. Much of the population lives in areas without any resources because the state, the colonial system, hasn't provided any resources to support them. So you've got tribalism, you've got regionalism, you've got economic underdevelopment, and the Congo was sort of the poster child for the ills of colonialism because it suffered from all of these problems to an acute degree. So this was a European colony which, when independence did come, was going to be facing enormous challenges to try to create a coherent and stable nation state. Now, given those conditions that exist in Africa, the moves towards independence by the late 1940s, the willingness of the colonial powers to concede, in most cases, to the independence movements, the fundamental problems troubling many African colonies of regionalism, tribalism, and economic underdevelopment. With that as a background, we now also have to look at what are the two major superpowers doing in regards to Africa at this time. For the United States, its history had been one of anti-colonialism. Americans would proudly point out that we ourselves emerged as a nation as a result of an anti-colonial struggle thrown off British control. Traditionally, the United States had opposed European colonialism, in no small part because it cut the United States off from economic interactions with those colonies. A European colony is probably not going to have much opportunity to trade with the United States. But there was also this political tradition that we opposed colonialism because we were former colonial people. We opposed it on practical grounds because it was bad for our economy. And of course, the United States had long trumpeted the idea of self-determination. And indeed, Woodrow Wilson had, of course, reiterated that very principle in his 14 points at Versailles. But the United States was coming to grips with certain realities in the period after World War II and as it entered the Cold War with the Soviet Union. It was a question of what were the priorities of the United States going to be in view of world conditions after 1945. The predominant position within the State Department, in other words, the people who make foreign policy for the most part, was that Europe was the most important place in the world for the United States after 1945. Europe had been the economic, intellectual core of the Western world for centuries. It had what had very recently been some of the largest and most important economies in the world: Germany, England, France. It now lay prostrate after the devastation of World War II, and apparently was in the sights of the Soviet Union. The United States would launch a massive program of aid, the Marshall Plan, to help rebuild the European economies, to strengthen them, and thereby strengthen ourselves by rebuilding what we assumed, of course, would be our close allies for the future. So the State Department's argument is this is our top priority. We have to worry about Europe, rebuilding Europe, and saving it from Soviet expansionism. Repeatedly, after World War II, despite what Wilson had said, and despite Franklin Roosevelt's comments in a similar vein that he opposed European colonialism, the United States was going to favor its European allies when it came to the question of decolonization. We're going to see this next time in Vietnam as well, dealing with the French in Vietnam. This was the approach of the United States with the Dutch in terms of Indonesia, whether Indonesia should get independence. In Africa, the Americans would speak glowingly about the rights of people around the world to self-determination. But the United States would refuse to offer any direct assistance to leaders seeking independence for African colonies. So the official stances were opposed to colonialism and we support self-determination. But as far as any material assistance or any pressure being put on European powers to end colonialism, that the United States was not going to do. Now, if the British and the French made a decision on their own that yes, they were going to make certain concessions with certain colonies and end their colonial status, that was up to them. Fine, they were making their own practical decision, but we weren't going to force them to do it. So Africa would simply have to wait. There were more important issues, specifically winning the Cold War in Europe, and the overwhelming argument that American leaders accepted after 1945 was the Europeans right now can't afford to lose these colonies. Yeah, their economies have been devastated. What they need is access to the resources in these colonies. We can't jeopardize that economic recovery by pressuring them to surrender colonies. When the British and the French feel like it, fine. And the others, well, whenever they get around to it. But we are not going to pressure them. So the official American position is Africa will simply have to wait. There are higher priorities. Now, as far as the Soviet Union, this would appear to be a golden opportunity for the Soviets because, of course, here's the United States speaking of self-determination and speaking against colonialism, but they practically speaking, they won't do anything about it. However, initially at least, from 1945 through about 1955, for about a decade after World War II, the Soviets weren't doing anything either. And the reason the Soviets weren't doing anything in Africa, weren't out there promoting third world revolutions, is that, first of all, Stalin was concerned about history. And history told him that two bad things had happened to the Soviet Union in the past 100 years. And both of them came out of Western Europe. One of them was called Napoleon Bonaparte, and the other was called Adolf Hitler. They both invaded Mother Russia and nearly destroyed it. Stalin's major concern was to make sure that the Soviet Union was protected against its enemies from the West. This is one of the major reasons for building a series of states in Eastern Europe that the Soviets could dominate, so that they would have a buffer between them and the West to protect them. Besides that practical consideration, growing out of a historical experience, Stalin also had an ideological concern. And that was, as a Marxist, he understood that Marx had posited revolution coming in societies which were either fully industrialized or certainly well along the road to industrialization, because it was going to be the proletariat, the working class, people in the industrial sector, who would lead the revolution. Now, of course, in Russia, it could be said that, well, Russia wasn't that far along with industrialization, but it did have a large and important working class in its major urban centers, and they had played an important role in the revolution. But when Stalin looked in places like Africa and elsewhere in the Third World, he didn't see any industrial working class. So his obvious conclusion is, well, they're not going to have Marxist revolutions any time in the foreseeable future. So what's the sense in getting involved there? You know, wasting our time. You know, we're going to have to wait until the history catches up, until these places industrialize. Then there's the potential for communist revolution. In the meantime, I'm going to worry about Europe and protecting the Soviet Union from the West. So Stalin's answer is, well, they'll have to wait. Just like the Americans said Africa will have to wait, Stalin says, well, Africa and the whole Third World is going to have to wait. We get bigger fish to fry. However, Stalin died. He was replaced by Nikita Khrushchev. And Khrushchev took a very different view of all of this. He felt that the Soviet Union had a large number of potential allies, not necessarily because they were ideologically communists, but because so many leaders in the Third World, independence leaders and others, saw the Soviet Union as an example of what could be accomplished by an underdeveloped country, that it could throw off the domination of the West and could industrialize, could modernize, and do it in a rather rapid fashion. So in many ways, the Soviet Union was a model for these leaders, even though they themselves were not communists. And for Khrushchev, this was an ideal opportunity. All right, so they're not communists, so they don't have a proletariat. That's okay. They're anti-Western, and they're looking for an alternative model. They could be allies of ours. Very practical reasons. So Khrushchev begins paying more attention to the Third World, far more at least than Stalin ever did. And he begins trumpeting the Soviet Union as an ally of independence movements and Third World leaders. One of his early examples was his assistance to Egypt. Egypt wanted to build the Aswan High Dam to provide power and irrigation for Egypt. And of course, Nasser, the leader of Egypt, was not getting a great deal of support from European powers or the United States, who didn't like him. He was too much of a nationalist. So Khrushchev offered the essential technical and financial assistance to build the Aswan High Dam, one of the great accomplishments of Nasser's administration, and of course serving as a great symbol to Third World leaders that the Soviet Union is somebody you can count on, because you certainly can't count on the West. So we're here. We may not exactly see eye to eye ideologically, but we can certainly work together. As far as the specifics of the Congo go, the United States saw in the Congo, particularly as the Soviet Union made it clear that it was going to be a player in the Third World and in independence movements in Africa, it saw some very critical factors coming into play in terms of the future of the Congo. One, the Congo was an important source of copper and cobalt. Now, the U.S. didn't buy most of the copper from the Congo. Most of that was sold in Europe, as it had long been. But of course, if the Congo were to disappear as a major source of copper for Western economies, the price of copper would shoot up. Same thing that happens with oil. It doesn't make any difference where the oil is going, even if most of Saudi Arabia's oil is going to Europe and Japan. Doesn't make any difference. If the price of Saudi oil shoots up, the price of oil everywhere shoots up. Same principle in the Congo. If the price of copper should shoot up, if communists were to take over and shut off the exports of copper to the West, the price of a vital industrial metal will go through the roof. And cobalt was important because it was important for making bombs. As far as the Congo's location and size, it is one of the largest African colonies, and it is located right literally in the heart of Africa. So it has the potential size, population, and economic wealth in terms of its resources, that's potential, to influence events throughout all of sub-Saharan Africa. The Congo could well be, from the perspective of the 1950s, the country that was going to shape the future of Africa. And finally, there was the simple fact that the Soviets are taking a lot more interest in the Third World by the mid-1950s, and they're going to take an interest in the Congo. So for no other reason, the US was going to be concerned because it wanted to counter what it saw as Soviet influence and, of course, a Soviet threat. So these forces are coming to bear in the 1950s. The move towards African independence. The unpreparedness of the Congo in terms of regionalism, tribalism, economic underdevelopment. The stance of the United States, which favors self-determination but doesn't want to do anything about it, but then finds it has some very strategic interests in the Congo. And the Soviet Union, which for a long time didn't pay any attention to the Third World, but now, as of the 1950s, is starting to pay a lot of attention under Khrushchev. In the Congo itself, the Belgians discover that indeed the Congolese are intense nationalists. A series of movements develop demanding independence in the Congo. We'll talk about a few of them in a moment. There are mass demonstrations demanding independence. And in 1959, the Belgians finally agree that they will grant independence. In fact, they're going to grant it the very next year in 1960. Now, they're not going to wait long. Why? In part, simply the sheer size of the demonstrations, the question of the challenge of trying to suppress these movements, and also pressure from the British and the French. We're saying, well, look, the practical thing here is not to allow this to go to extremes. You allow nationalist movements to arise, and then you try to suppress them, and what you get are more extreme movements, like communists, who come along and say, well, you're being repressed by the imperialists, now you must take a more radical stance. So preempt that possible move towards radicalism, grant them independence. And the Belgians agree. There are three major players in the move towards independence, in terms of major players within the Congo. One is a man named Joseph Kasavubu. Kasavubu was educated in Catholic schools by the Belgians. His movement, which had the acronym BABACO, was an independence movement focused on the independence of the Congolese people. In other words, the primary purpose of this movement initially is not the independence of the colony of the Congo, but the Congolese people. And this was true of a number of independence movements in Africa, that their initial concern was to liberate their ethnic, their linguistic group. They weren't focused on the political entity called the Congo or the political entity called Angola. They were focused on an ethnic or linguistic group. And that's exactly what the case was with Kasavubu. At the same time, he was considered pro-Western, that he was fairly friendly with the Belgians despite his demand for independence. The second figure was a man named Mwishambe. He was from Katanga province in southeast Congo. His movement, Kanakat, was designed to liberate the Katangese people. Again, he's not talking about the whole Congo colony. And in his case, that would have practical significance because Katanga province was the heart of the mineral wealth of the Congo. Most of the copper and other mineral wealth that was being extracted from the Congo came from this one province in the southeastern portions of the colony. And then the third figure, Patrice Lumumba, who headed of these movements the one that talked about the Congo as a whole, the Congolese national movement that did focus on liberating the entire colony. That was largely because Lumumba came from a part of the Congo that was ethnically diverse. So he knew that if he was going to have real influence, he needed to appeal to a large array of people, not just to a single ethnic or tribal group. So these are the three key players in terms of independence. There are other political parties, a number of them, but these are the three principal ones. And each of them represents not only specific interests, but specific regions. Kasavubu is from Leopoldville province. It's like the federal province in the western part of the country. That's his main bailiwick. Shombe is from Katanga province, whose capital is Elizabethville, named after Queen Elizabeth. And the third, Lumumba, is from Oriental province, up in the northeast, with its capital at Stanleyville, named after, of course, Henry Stanley. Very indigenous. So we see not only, particularly with Kasavubu and Shombe, ethnically distinct movements, but also with all three of them, movements that come from specific regions of the country, reflecting the importance of these issues in the Congo itself, that there are real ethnic divisions and diversities, and there are real regional differences. These are the three movements, these are the three men who are the prime competitors to lead the Congo into independence. Now, the national election is held in the spring of 1960. And Lumumba's movement, the MNC, earns 34 seats out of 137 in the new National Assembly. Now, that may not seem like a lot because you look at it and say, well, gee, it's only 34 of 137. But it was the largest number won by any single political party. Remember, these aren't the only three political parties running. There are a number of others. No group comes even close to getting the 34 that Lumumba gets. This was in part because his was the only political movement that ran candidates in 5 of the 6 provinces. There were 6 provinces. Nobody else tried to run in as many as 5. He did. So his party was fairly diverse, and they were able to garner a number of seats. It was also clear that Lumumba would be able to put together a coalition to give him a majority in the National Assembly. And this is a parliamentary system that's being created. So in other words, the national leader is the leader who can put together a majority in the National Assembly. This is the person that will become prime minister, and that's Lumumba. Kasavubu, who finished second in terms of the number of seats guarded, is going to become president. President in a parliamentary system is largely an honorary position. What it means basically is that you get to meet heads of state when they come to visit, that sort of thing. But you don't have a lot of power. It's kind of like the Queen in England. The Queen gets to call new parliamentary elections, but that's about the only power she has, other than being a tourist attraction. And that was sort of where Kasavubu was left, but it was some acknowledgement of the fact that his party had finished fairly high up in the results. Now, this is, in a way, a conditional independence, because to gain it, the Congolese have to accept the continued presence of 4,000 Belgian troops. So this isn't, the Belgians are suddenly walking away completely. 2,000 are going to be stationed in Leopoldville, in the capital, and 2,000 are going to be stationed in Elizabethville in Katanga province. Now, why would they put 2,000 in Elizabethville in Katanga province? Because that's where the money is. You got the capital, and you got the mining center where most of the wealth of the new country is going to be generated. The Belgians want troops in both places. And the understanding is this is to ensure a peaceful transition, to ensure stability while the new national government is getting, its legs under it. In fact, there was no clear decision on when the Belgians would have to leave. So this could go on for a long time. Almost immediately, there is a problem. And that is unrest in the new Congolese military. The new Congolese army is essentially the old colonial army, absent those 4,000 troops that are still there and operating as Belgian soldiers representing the Belgian government. In other words, the new Congolese army consists largely of Congolese recruits and non-commissioned officers who were the colonial army, and white officers who have all the top command positions. The Congolese in the new national army are upset because the positions they hold are as recruits and NCOs. They don't get any commissioned officer slots. And the white officers, of course, are getting a heck of a lot of money in terms of their pay compared to what the Congolese are being paid. So immediately there is unrest in the national army over these issues. And this is going to be a trigger point for general unrest in the country in the months ahead, is the problem of how to pacify the new military, which consists largely of Congolese troops who are upset about the fact that white officers, most of them Belgians, some of them simply mercenaries, are still in charge and receiving a lot more pay than they are. Now, into this mix, and this rather unstable mix with this new government, this new country, with all of these problems of underdevelopment, tribalism, regionalism, etc., and now unrest in its new national military, there are three key Americans who are on the scene observing what is going on and keeping Washington informed of what they see happening. Those three men are as follows. One, the U.S. ambassador to the new independent Congo, a man named Clark Timberlake. Clark Timberlake was a hard-nosed Cold Warrior. In other words, he was a vehement anti-communist. He was highly suspicious of anyone that was at least in any way sympathetic to the Soviet Union. In addition to the ambassador is the first secretary of the U.S. Embassy, a man named Frank Carlucci. Now, Carlucci officially is filling a diplomatic position, but his career, which ran for decades, all the way into the Reagan administration, was largely focused in the areas of intelligence work, although his official positions were often diplomatic posts. And then finally, there is Frank Carlucci. Lawrence Devlin as the third figure. Lawrence Devlin is the head of the CIA station in Leopoldville. He's the chief of station. So he's the top CIA officer in the capital of the Congo. You might say, well, gee, they just formed the country. They already got a CIA station there. Yeah, they had been forming them and placing them in these countries throughout the 1950s. They knew that independence was coming in many of these cases, and they wanted to keep tabs on what was happening. So right from the beginning, there's a CIA station and the CIA station chief, and Lawrence Devlin will be intimately involved in the events that will unfold in the months ahead, directing what the CIA's activities will be in the Congo as the days unfold. The beginning and the beginning of the end for Patrice Lumumba and his government comes on Independence Day, June 30th, 1960. On June 30th, 1960, dignitaries from the Belgian government, from governments around the world, including Ambassador Timberlake, gather in Leopoldville for an official independence ceremony. And, not surprisingly, at that ceremony, Patrice Lumumba will make a speech. Now, it is only after years that we've managed to recover a fairly accurate transcript of what Lumumba actually said in this address. I mean, things were not highly organized. They weren't passing out copies. This was something that Lumumba had quickly written up. And eyewitness accounts have varied considerably. What we know is that his speech infuriated the Belgians and Ambassador Timberlake. He and other foreigners took this to be a radical threat to Western interests in the Congo. The essence of Lumumba's speech was, in fact, saying that his people had sacrificed enormously in order to achieve independence. He didn't really say a lot of nasty things about the Belgians, but of course he didn't thank them either. He was essentially saying, yes, it's great to be independent. We're independent because we fought for it. Now you're going to go, I'll go home. He did not laud the Belgians for their contributions to Congolese civilization, whatever. There was, in fact, very little reason why he should. One short quote that I think captures his essence of critique of the Belgians is this, which comes directly from his speech. When he said, and finally, he was talking about who can forget, the people who sacrificed and the demonstrations and so forth. And then he says, and who went to jail, etc. And finally, who can forget the hangings and the firing squads? And of course, that just infuriated the Belgians because, of course, Lumumba was pointing the finger at them and saying, well, you murdered all these people trying to prevent independence from coming about. From that moment forward, Timberlake would be unrelentingly hostile towards Lumumba and assume that Lumumba was, if not a communist, then at least a fellow traveler. In other words, somebody sympathetic to communist interests, etc. In fact, of probably all of the people we're going to look at and have looked at in terms of CIA interventions, national leaders that were intervened against, Lumumba was the least ideological. He was obviously a nationalist, but he didn't have a lot of tightly formed ideas about political ideology. He knew he wanted independence for his country, and beyond that, he really didn't pronounce in terms of ideological issues. People like Mahatma Gandhi, Kwame Nkrumah, you can think of dozens of third world leaders at this time were far more ideological, whether they were left of center or right of center, nationalists. Lumumba was largely somebody who had come to the fore as an eloquent speaker and someone who was wise enough to try to put together a diverse range of supporters in the Congo, but he didn't have any clearly defined ideological position. But his speech at this time was taken, at least by Timberlake, as a clear indication that anybody that would be that critical of the Belgians, you know, a Western ally of ours, must be a communist or a fellow traveler. And he would respond in that fashion. And indeed, in a very short time, within less than 6 weeks after this speech, the United States would already be plotting the overthrow and indeed the assassination of Patrice Lumumba. How that actually comes about, we'll get back to when we return in a couple of minutes and look at the second half of the intervention in the Congo.